Hey guys, Matt here. So I interviewed Dr. Brian Keating, actually Professor Brian Keating, although it says doctor here, so I suppose he's a doctor and a professor. But you know, setting that aside, the guy's just a fantastic human being. He's an amazing science communicator. I mean, just look at he's got some serious junk in his trunk here. He's interviewed 22 Nobel Prize winning guests. He, of course, has his own sort of slightly frustrating Nobel Prize story, which we go into in some detail in this. He came very, very close to obtaining the title himself. But, you know, we discussed the possibility of the negative impact of some of these sorts of processes on real science. But setting that aside, we discussed sort of early universe formation, sort of opinions on the Big Bang and stuff like that. We had a good laugh about English food and different names of breakfast. He's just fantastic because he's approachable, he's fun. Um, just look what we got here, right? So he actually says in the description of his website that if you have a look here, right? So this is the podcast Into the Impossible. I've been watching this stuff for years. Many of us in Cheltenham UK Philosophers have been following his work. It's just fantastic, and because he's so smart and he's kind of on the inside of physics and science, he just asks brilliant questions and gets brilliant guests as well, right? He's interviewed most of my guests, so Donald Hoffman, Mike Levin, Philip Goff, amongst others. Although I did suggest Jenny Nielsen, and I think that he was quite keen on talking to her with her topological unified field theory. Should be of interest to Brian and some of his followers. But yeah, it says here, look, every week I provide you with long-form interviews rather, with a brilliant thought leader and deep dive into a fascinating STEM subject. I mean, every week he does this stuff, right? He works really hard on this. These are really, really good quality, well-produced interviews. Here's an example. Look at that. Look at this.
Earth's been hit before, and it'll get hit again. 66 million years ago, a rock from space erased the dinosaurs in under 3 minutes.
This is the quality that we're talking. This guy is a professional science communicator, educator. Look, he gets all these fantastic guests on. This is something to aspire to for me. I wish I had the know-how and the expertise to be able to deliver this kind of quality. But yeah, here he is, Brian Keating. I'm so honoured that he would speak to me for an hour. He said he was on to another call straight after that, which is unsurprising given his charm, wit, intelligence, and goodness of character. We even touch on religion and God and all that stuff as well, which seems to be quite a common thing these days with my guests. So, we always said we wanted to be there at the intersection of philosophy, science, and mysticism, and the nature of the guests and the guests and the breadth of their interest, and almost sort of cosmopolitan intellects in a way. It seems to be supporting that journey or directive. So, yeah. It's a fun interview, and I hope you enjoy it. Speak soon. Take care. Bye. Hey, Brian.
Pleasure to see you, Matt. Thanks for staying up late and getting me up early here in California.
Yeah, I imagine it's sunny where you are over in California at the moment. But thanks so much. It's a massive privilege to have you here, because not only are you a sort of forerunning physicist, leading thinker in science, but you're also a podcast. You're a populariser of physics and science more broadly, and philosophy. I mean, you've interviewed at least half of my former guests. So, first of all, thank you from everyone within the Cheltenham UK Philosophers community that you're doing a great service. And that actually could we start just by getting a bit of a kind of origin story, because perhaps not all of our members are as familiar with you, but I mean, for me, you're rock and roll. I get beers and pizza and watch you guys on Friday night. It's just fantastic stuff, right? But could you tell us about how you ended up, doing this and why it's so important to you, and why physics, and tell us about your journey, Brian.
Yeah. Well, obviously I did it for the money, as something I always wanted to be wealthy and famous and earn the respect of podcasters everywhere. No, I mean, it's funny because, podcasts didn't exist, 25 years ago. And
Yeah.
you see behind me, if you're watching it, I don't know, this will be on video, right? So you'll see the open the pod bay doors. So that's my catchphrase, but that is actually the origin of the word podcast. It comes from 2001: A Space Odyssey, Sir Arthur C. Clarke.
Wow.
His famous pod, pod in the pod bay doors, that
Mm,
led an engineer at Apple named Vinny Sirico to come up with the idea for the iPod. And then literally the rest is history once that became kind of a noun. So the journey that we're on now, both of us, didn't even exist, literally 20 years
mm,
ago, until
mm,
20 years ago, I think this year. Um, so there's no way I could have expected it, predicted it, coming up on a third of a million subscribers just on YouTube, another 100,000 on audio. And it really came as a result of the pandemic. It really the only good
mm,
thing that came out of the pandemic, besides more time with my kids and wife, was the kind of ability to middling people like me to get top guests like 22 Nobel Prize winners and multiple authors, Pulitzer Prize winners, Fields medalists. They were confined to their homes as everyone was on this
mm,
little 1080p screen that we're on.
mm,
So it's sort of a miracle that led to the fact that all these book tours got canceled. And as an author, I knew how important book tours were. And I said, well, let me do a thing where I can do a virtual book tour from these big names. And I ended up getting, kind of the Matthew effect, rich get richer. And the more good guests I had on and great guests I had on, and that would lead to more and more. And
mm,
I can't think of anyone, that I really, haven't had on that I'm just dying to come on, and he or
mm,
she won't come on. So it's been wonderful. And but my actual origin story started, over 50 years ago in New York State, on our island. It competes with the British Isles. It's called Long Island. I was born there. My father was a professor of mathematics at SUNY Stony Brook, and that was my personal Big Bang occurred there. I guess maybe it occurred 9 months earlier if you count my parents, but we'll keep it PG-13, of course. And the
mm,
journey to become a scientist, it was like being, a wizard or something, or an
mm,
ice cream taster. I never thought, oh, this is something I can actually do for a living, to be an astronomer, a professor at a top university in the world, and travel the world and go to, six of the seven continents, including Antarctica. I still have to
mm.
go to Africa.
Yeah.
That's on my bucket list, of course, but I've given speeches on six continents.
Mm,
And, never would have thought it would be possible, but for the fact that, kind of by luck and hard work, I think I work really hard and always have to really, be in the mix of the most interesting aspects of
mm,
physics and astronomy and cosmology. And now science popularization is
mm,
is a great honor that I get to do. And, normally on a Tuesday morning, like we're talking, I might be on one of four different telecons, talking about, some strike in Chile, or, some shipment to Antarctica or whatever that went awry. And, and
mm.
those are all conversations I would say I have to have. But
Yeah.
conversations like this and with my guests are conversations I want to have,
Mm,
to share the intellectual, kind of energy that I get is a
mm,
process that really is truly exciting. And there's no better time, I think, in history to be a cosmologist or an
mm.
astrophysicist like I am.
Yeah.
And then all the more so to get to talk to great minds all over the world, at the speed
Mm,
of light. So it
yeah.
doesn't get any better than this. I'm so blessed to be able to do it.
It doesn't. And that's the rock and roll sort of element for me as well. And COVID affected me as well. Time with the kids, time to do what you wanted to, sort of like go for walks and stuff, like get some fresh air, get some exercise, and watch guys like yourselves on your podcast sharing some of the most complex, deep, profound ideas you could possibly imagine. That's just it's blissful, isn't it? And it's so
It's so
cool. And
nice.
for all of my guests, I do a bit of research as much as I'm able to, given my time constraints. And and obviously, part of your big story is this sort of Nobel Prize thing, isn't it? And I think that's really cool the way you've responded to that, and you've talked about the whole process, and you've got a very, you're sharing. But it hasn't defined you. Do you know what I mean? There's a hell of a lot more to you than just that. But do you want to talk about a little bit about that because
Sure,
you're
yeah.
very
I
close?
mean,
Yeah, yeah.
as a young scientist, so my father, was a professor, as I said, in mathematics, and a good and a very top-notch mathematician. And
Mm,
later he went into physics as well, and foundations of quantum mechanics and all sorts of interesting aspects of physics that a
mm,
mathematician could tackle. and we were kind of competitive, here, like many fathers and sons, and I always kind of wanted to outdo him and and win prizes and awards that he never won. Like you might do with your kids playing football or whatever you guys call it football, we call it soccer, but
Mm,
playing football here, American football, it's often the father was captain of the football team in high school,
mm,
and he's trying to relive his glory. Now here's his son,
mm,
and they're trying to compete with each other. So we had that rivalry.
mm,
Wasn't the most healthy, but I knew for a fact he never won a Nobel Prize. So I knew, case
mm.
closed, if I could win a
If you
Nobel
do that,
Prize, I
yeah.
had permanent bragging rights, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so that kind of led me down a dark path because it became, in Judaism, there's grave sin, which I'm Jewish, and the practice of idol worship is very common, and there are many
Mm,
different types of idols. I mean, I've already mentioned a couple of them, from YouTube subscribers to
mm,
university professors to, what college your kids go to, what how many subscribers you have on
mm,
Instagram or followers. These are all idols, right? Money,
mm,
obviously famous, but in academia, it's if you get 10 citations to a paper, as you know, it's like considered a decent paper and a
mm,
pretty well regarded one. And but the stakes are so small compared to all these other metrics that I think
mm,
a lot of academics, such as myself, look to other ways of validation. And part of
mm,
that validation was winning awards and prizes. And the biggest one of all, I mean, we're talking early, mid-December, and every year on December 10th, which is Alfred Nobel's death day, these worshipers go to Sweden and bow down and accept a
mm.
gilded graven image with the visage of Alfred Nobel. And I mean, it couldn't be more scatological. It couldn't be more, kind of cultish. And
Yeah.
but it's all in good fun, right? I mean, it doesn't
Mm,
really harm anyone except what it does, right? If you look at it from the perspective of it determines funding decisions, it determines
mm,
who gets hired at universities. I was told by my department chair at the time when I was hired that his father had actually
mm,
won the Nobel Prize for inventing the laser in Russia.
mm,
He told me, "Well, we kind of hired you because we think you're going to win a Nobel Prize, and if you don't, it'll disappoint a lot of us." So
mm,
I was told that in no uncertain terms that was kind of the path that I was on because of the experiment that I co-invented
mm,
when I was in this purgatory of being a postdoc at Caltech in Pasadena, where I spent three years. So that experiment was, kind of designed by me and my colleagues to take the earliest baby picture of the universe, using it's called the cosmic microwave background radiation, which is the oldest light in the universe, but it's not the oldest radiation.
mm,
If the universe began in a singularity, a Big Bang singularity of the kind that Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose and others have talked about in singularity theorem. So
mm,
the question of whether or not the universe had this explosive origin that came out of the result of a singularity or sort of a
mm,
singularity in reverse, that was an obsession of mine. Then I designed the first experiment ever to tackle it, and that was in the year
mm.
2000 or so. And
I
because
mean,
of that experiment,
that's freaking unbelievable, Brian, isn't it?
yeah,
You
I mean, for
designed
a
the
kid who,
experiment to detect the earliest freaking photons from the Big Bang. I mean, come on.
yeah, it would be great if
That's
we
amazing.
succeeded, right? If we
Yeah, but
actually, detected it instead of detecting
yeah,
microscopic
but even
grains of.
driving forward the technology in that
Oh, of course,
direction,
yeah.
framing the problem, defining the concepts,
Look, we're still doing
that's
it
a
now, and there's a
yeah.
huge component of the United Kingdom that's playing a big role. Michael Brown at
Mm,
Manchester, my colleague Lucio Piccirillo. There's a UK, investment of 20 million plus pounds to lead the observatory to double, some of its capabilities in the next 5 years, and that's called the
fantastic.
Simons Observatory. The
Wow.
previous experiment I invented at Caltech that took us to the precipice of a Nobel Prize, and then spoiler alert, my first book is called Losing the Nobel Prize. So, that did not pan out in that sense. But yeah, you're right. To seek, to strive, and
Mm,
not to yield, as Lord Tennyson would say, right? And that's actually on the plaque in McMurdo Sound, Antarctica, where
mm,
the commemoration of the deaths of Roald Amundsen and his team is memorialized, so that
mm,
kind of striking without yielding and
mm,
striving without yielding is at the core, I think, of good science and
mm,
adventure. And it's been incredible. And like I said, we're continuing. We haven't given up. In fact, the bicep kind of debacle in some sense
mm,
led to the birth and eventual, progress that we're making with the Simons Observatory, which is
Mm,
about a $200 million experiment now.
mm,
So this is just, yeah, beyond any of my wildest dreams for a kid in Long Island, New
mm.
York, who,
Yeah.
had a tiny little telescope looking at the craters of the moon back when he was 10 and never thought, oh, this is going to be a job for me someday, right?
Mm. Is that what really drove you, though? Was it sort of wonder at the majesty of creation itself and just what is going on? I mean,
Yeah, you may
what
know
sorts of
that.
questions drive you, Brian?
Yeah,
What are you trying to find out?
you're undoubtedly aware of the love affair that physicists have for philosophers, right? So
Mm.
that's
Yeah, well, like, maybe love hate, you know.
actually, yeah. So I actually do love philosophy, and I've always been
Mm.
interested in the biggest questions there are, and philosophy is the entree into those discussions, right? So
Yeah,
there's no
yeah.
better place to kind of endeavor to understand the biggest picture aspects of life. And actually, my
Mm.
hero of heroes, is this guy Galileo Galilei. You see my finger puppet of him holding a little telescope. And he used to say that the
Love it.
telescope had the ability to transform the vexations of philosophers into utter certainty. In other words,
Mm.
you philosophers would speculate what is the nature or makeup of the Milky Way galaxy, for example. And you talk about, it could
Mm.
be this, it could be that. And then he could prove with his
Yeah.
telescope a little bit of confirmation bias at
Mm.
work, but the he could prove that it was made of stars, and that's all it
Mm.
was. In fact, it's not,
Mm.
as I say. But the virtue of the philosophical questions being resolvable using
Mm.
instrumentation. So I'm an
Yeah.
experimental astrophysicist. I'm a
Mm. Yeah.
cosmologist. I study the origin, evolution, composition, eventual fate of the universe using tools and telescopes that my colleagues and I, my students and I, build, deploy,
Mm.
collect data from, and then analyze data and then write papers. And this process can take 20
Mm.
years. It's
Yeah.
not uncommon. So it's a long-term endeavor, but the philosophical core at heart has always been to only address the questions I find most interesting that affect the biggest picture topics in the universe. So,
Mm.
origin of the universe, pretty big topic. And so I try not to get led astray by things like, are there aliens? Are there,
Yeah.
life
Yeah.
forms on other planets? As interesting as those are and as philosophical as
Mm.
those are, I have to stay focused, no pun intended,
Yeah.
on what I can do uniquely so, which is to measure and report on what we see.
Right. I mean, reality is magical enough without these other phenomena, isn't it? So, do you know what I mean? It's exciting enough to try and understand what our substrate is, without aliens, man. Um,
That's right.
Physics has become quite speculative, hasn't it? And I mean, this reminds me of a question that one of our members, Lynton Cox, has raised. I haven't got the detail in front of me, but it's to do with has cosmology got a little bit like speculative philosophy in some areas, and are there areas of it that just are simply not testable anymore, or is
Mm.
that unfair?
Yeah, I mean, I've sort of lamented the fact that a lot of what we do in the future of cosmology might be relegated to social proof, not actual scientific proof. And the reason I say that is of the dominant theories of cosmogenesis. So cosmology isn't necessarily, required to come up with the origin of the universe any more than, say, an evolutionary biologist like my
Mm,
friend Richard Dawkins, and I'm sure your listeners are quite familiar with.
mm,
I've hosted him here in North America.
mm,
That he's not responsible for explaining the origin of life. I mean, he may be interested in it,
mm,
and it may be extremely, exquisitely, fascinating as it is to
mm,
me. But it's not really a part of evolutionary biology on Earth
mm,
necessarily, whether or not some enzymes formed on a comet that impacted the Earth, 12 billion years, 10 billion, 4 billion years ago, it can't be older than the Earth. So the
mm,
question of the origin of the universe is a very fascinating one. It
mm,
may belong, theories of cosmogony may belong within cosmology. I certainly am obsessed with them,
mm,
but the fact that we sort of treat them as sort of synonymous, that the origin of the universe and therefore the Big Bang itself is sort of the default explanation. When
mm,
in reality, I've had a good friend of mine, Nayash Afshorty at Perimeter Institute in Waterloo. He wrote a book called The Battle of the Big Bang with a colleague, Phil Halpern. And that book, traces 32 different types of Big Bangs. So
mm.
it's
Yeah,
a misnomer
yeah.
to say, I often give talks, was there a Big Bang with the letter
Mm,
A capitalized? Because that to me is the real sorting point. Was
mm,
there one Big Bang? whether infinite Big Bangs, was there even a Big Bang?
Mm,
In other words, was there no Big Bang? And
mm,
so the question of those may not be amenable to the Popperian kind of investigations. Not that Popper is the last
mm,
word either, but it
mm,
certainly gives a framework. And in this case, if you look for falsification as your rubric to assess the validity of a scientific claim, then you would have to say that where there are singularities and event horizons, as there are with black holes and with the origin of the universe, uniquely. I mean, those are the only two binequally. I don't know. There's two instantiations of singularities
mm,
in advanced physics, and those are black holes and the Big Bang. Neither one of
mm,
those can be witnessed, right? So those are enshrouded in an inscrutable layer of protection. So if we can't assess a model because we can never observe it and we can never acquire physical data from it itself,
mm,
and only have mathematical speculation and some corroboration that's circumstantial, what do we do? I mean, we can't
mm,
falsify it and we can't prove it. So
mm,
I'm drawn to models that make definitive predictions that can be
mm,
disproven because at least you can say something. The problem, though, Matt, is that you may not be in a position to ever have the sensitivity by instrumentation standards. In other words, that even a theoretical perfect experiment,
mm,
because of certain limitations we can talk about, called cosmic variance and the intrinsic uncertainty that we have in trying to make a statistical claim about a unique universe that we have access to, we
mm,
may never be able to falsify the dominant model that predicts the singularity, and
mm,
we may never be able to prove it either. So
mm,
we're in this like purgatory of no man's land where unable to disconfirm or to
mm,
confirm. So what does science do in such situations?
mm.
It's very
And of course,
it's a very unusual time, and it's
the
courtesy of the advancements in technology that my colleagues have really developed in our
mm,
tools and our techniques.
mm. I mean, that's certainly thinking as an experimentalist as opposed to sort of theory, because you have to engineer something
Yeah.
that tests these claims. And, there's almost, for me, the idea that something can be engineered lends validity to the claims in and of itself, right? But I'm just thinking, the conditions near a black hole just wouldn't allow for any any testing equipment. This is the problem, isn't it? You need something half the size of the known universe to be able to do it or something. So, but is it possible? Do you think this is a bit philosophical? Do you think that singularities, the Big Bang, is there a possible that they represent more of the limits of our understanding, or perhaps the limits of the mathematical modeling capability that we have within our gift? Is that possible?
Well, certainly in broad strokes, both the Big Bang and black holes have been comprehensible, at least for, hundreds of years in the case of black
Mm,
holes, maybe
mm,
100 years in the case of a cosmological origin, a Big Bang.
mm,
And that, kind of was ushered in by Lemaitre in 1929. And then, people like there are scientists in England using Newton's laws to calculate the escape velocity from an infinitely massive object and found that it was, even greater than infinite speed or would require infinite velocity. And that was
mm,
before they measured the speed of light even. So there were concepts
mm,
of black holes that were dark stars. John Mitchell in the UK made up, discovered these sorts of ideas. And
mm,
then, yeah, the cosmological singularity. So we've been able to grapple with them and think about them, but seemingly, philosophically, they're testable using, thought experiments,
mm,
Gedanken experiments, and so forth. But in reality, yeah, you're right. We can't actually approach them now. Where they do provide some potential long range signals,
mm,
as they do in the case of even Hawking radiation, in the case of a black hole, or gravitational radiation from binary black holes. It's not the
mm,
same as the event horizon, but we've imaged the photosphere, not actually the event horizon, but the photosphere around a black hole. It's a little technical
mm,
to describe all the different, black holes have, as many different properties as the Brits have for naming, breakfast items. I mean, there's just or tea or something like there's so many different qualifiers we can get into, but they do have an ability to exchange information with the
mm,
outside world. Therefore, we can hope to make measurable. Another thing Galileo said is, let us measure what is measurable, but make
mm,
measurable what is not yet so. And don't forget, he was a natural philosopher. They used to call physicists. They didn't have the word
Mm.
physicist until 100, 200 years later. But
Yeah.
now, he was called a natural philosopher. So he engaged in it. And the point is the ability of a scientist to make something amenable to our senses is a crucial part of the scientific method. I mean, without it, it's pure math, and I don't think there's
Mm.
anything wrong with pure math. But
Mm.
you're right. There are precious few things, and therefore, when nature affords us, a peek under her veil, or lift up the curtain, we should take advantage of that and use
Mm.
whatever tools we can. And in the case of what I do, we can't use light, because not just because the universe didn't have the types of light that we're looking at right now at each other.
Mm.
It was microwaves, or it is now in the microwave region,
Mm.
but because the process by which the elements, in the upper left of the periodic table form, the helium, hydrogen, and so forth, when they form, they obscure the processes that came before them. So
Mm.
essentially, it's like a fog. Like here in San Diego, the only kind of malevolent weather we get is in June. We get something called June gloom, which is usually preceded by May gray, and this is a low layer of basically coastal fog.
Mm.
And it's caused by a different temperature between the ocean and the surrounding land and the condensation. And so I can't see an airplane
Mm.
flying, 10,000 feet above me, but I can hear it. So
Yeah.
if we use something other than light, we can see, quote unquote, perceive things
Mm.
other than what produced that light and what came before what produced that light. So when you look in
Mm.
cosmology, you look back in space, you look out in space, you're looking back in time,
Yeah.
because of the finite speed of light. So we look back to a time before 500,000 years after the Big Bang, and that
Mm.
could be a singularity, it could be a previous cycle, it could be a variety of different things, but some hot dense phase of the early universe. If we try to look, earlier than 500,000 years or so, we can't use light. We can only
Mm.
use other types of radiation, and there's only two other types of radiation that are long range and could potentially provide a signal, and those are neutrinos, which
Mm.
are notoriously, nearly impossible to detect, and interact only weakly and via their gravitational effects. So
Mm.
they're not really that great. But actually, we want to go back and use waves of gravity, gravitational radiation. And so, if inflation, which is the theory that a quantum field fluctuated into existence,
Mm.
the energy density needed to ignite the Big Bang, then it would have also concomitantly produced gravitational radiation, which would exist before the cosmic microwave background, earlier times, at time equals, 10 to the minus 36 of a second after
Mm.
the origin of our observable universe.
Mm.
We seek to measure that signal via its imprint on the light of the microwave background that we can see via
Mm.
what's called its polarization, which is a lesser known property of light, but we can do it. And we
Mm.
measured a lot of the polarization of the CMB exquisitely accurately with experiments including BICEP and the Simons Array and now the Simons Observatory.
Mm.
But we have yet to measure definitively, that is, without contamination, a cosmological signal. With BICEP, we did measure a polarization signal that exactly mimicked what the inflationary epoch would predict. And
Mm.
that was called the B mode polarization of the CMB. But that was produced by these microscopic grains of dust. These are actually microscopic meteorites, not unlike the kind you can get at my website if you're in America. Unfortunately, Matt, I'm sorry, I can't ship. I tried to ship to the UK, and I do bring them when I go over to see. I was at Stonehenge this past summer in Manchester in
Oh,
Scotland.
nice.
So I
Mm.
brought a bunch of meteorites with me. But the US Postal Service will not allow me to ship them to the UK. But if you're listening anywhere
Mm.
else, go to briankeating.com/X and you can be entered into it. Unless you're an academic
Mm.
like me in the US, then go to briankeating.com/edu and I'll definitely send you one of these meteorites. So
Mm.
these are 4 billion year old objects that were present before our Earth formed from
Wow.
the preceding star that occupied this corner of our galaxy.
I love
And
that.
that these micrometeorites get magnetized in the Milky Way's magnetic field, and they can align like little tiny compass needles, and they produce the polarization signal that exactly mimicked what we thought we had seen with the CMB. So this was an
Nice.
incredible kind of detective story, but
Yeah.
in the end, yeah, it resulted in a disappointing, obviously disappointing, and and wanting, kind of to be helpful but without having a sense of confirmation bias.
Mm.
So it led to a lot of things. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What were you doing down at Stonehenge? That's literally just sort of 50 miles away from me.
Oh, is
There,
it
were you
really?
there with the Druids or?
I went there. Yeah, it was around. It was in July. I was trying with my family. I'd never been there. I felt like an astronomer should,
Yeah.
spend some time there and hang out there. And so I went there with my family. I did a video on my YouTube channel. It's actually called "From Stonehenge to the Space Age" or something like that.
Mm.
So I went from there to Jodrell Bank in Manchester,
So is this an
and
astronom? Is it a clock then?
well,
Stone.
it's not clear. There are certain
Mm.
astronomical attributes of it where it does, have these alignments, and the question is, if it aligns with stuff now and it was built 5,000 years ago and due to the
Mm.
precession of the Earth's axes,
Yeah.
where did it align? When did it align? When it was built? There's a great deal of mysteries
Mm.
about it.
Yeah.
I think it's safe to say it was used, in conjunction with, with observations of astronomical objects as,
Mm.
4,500 years later,
Mm.
if you went to Tycho Brahe's island, off the coast of Denmark, you would also find these things, or the North
Mm.
Sea, wherever he was.
Yeah.
He basically had this kind of similar thing with, like, basically built this giant chair on a protractor where he could slide up and down and look at the positions of, and he was the last naked eye astronomer. And
Right.
so there's similar things that line up there on his
Mm.
observatory.
Yeah.
And so yeah, there's quite likely it was used in
Mm.
part for that. How it
Yeah.
was built is a great mystery too. We don't
Yeah.
really
I mean,
understand.
what else is there to do when it's dark other than just sort of look at, you know what I mean?
Supposedly, like the mounds, the earthworks is actually even more impressive. I mean, it's a
Mm.
huge structure. The stones are very small. I was very disappointed that they didn't let me touch it. I guess they knew my kids are not to be trusted.
Mm.
So I ended up
Mm.
going through it and taking a drone with me and flying around it. But I
Nice.
wasn't able to get up and actually touch it. So
Yeah.
that'll have to, I'll have to get special permission someday.
Yeah. But have you been to Glastonbury? There's a
No,
hill
I
there
know
with
there's
a
another one there. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. The hippies and druids say that it's on a network of ley lines, and there's this magical sort of property there, and it does seem
Oh,
like
is
a
that
magical
right?
town. Yeah, it's a fantastic place.
Oh, okay.
I mean, if you, next time you're in the area, go to Glastonbury. That's an amazing place.
Okay.
But I've got some because I'm just a little bit conscious of time.
Yeah, yeah.
But some of our members' questions are so much better than the ones I came up with. So I'm
Okay.
just gonna I should have just led with them to be honest. Um, but yeah, so here's an interesting one. In pursuit of so this is from Lynton Cox. So Lynton is our brain box. He said, "I like Keating. He's thoughtful."
That's
And
right.
from Linton,
I appreciate that. I appreciate
that's
he.
extremely high praise from him. But he said, in pursuit of fundamental truths about the universe, scientists often endure extreme stress, failure, and isolation. Do you think the culture of heroic science sometimes sacrifices mental health or ethics for prestige?
Well, again, consulting my friend Galileo here, he could say a thing or two about it. I've been to Galileo's, final resting place, his prison outside of Florence, Italy, called Arcetri. I've had a conference there about the theory of relativity on its 100th anniversary of general
Yeah.
relativity, because
Mm,
Galileo came up with Galilean relativity, which is, basically what happens if you're on a boat and you throw a tennis ball or whatever.
mm,
And he thought about these issues very deeply, 300 years before Einstein would come about.
yeah.
So it certainly can. I mean, I think it was more common in the heroic age, of exploration and of intellectual pursuits that people would be driven to these kind of, manic, modes of operating. And
Mm,
certainly now, in modern age, when it's impossible, I say with pretty high confidence, it's almost impossible, if not maybe strictly impossible, for a single scientist to do
mm,
anything now.
yeah.
I mean, there are no, Einstein, and without an et al. After it, and because
Mm,
the low hanging fruit is gone. Right, a lot of the low
mm,
hanging fruit is gone. There are new discoveries being made and serendipitous things all the time, but those are made by enormous instruments like the dark energy survey instrument,
mm,
or the Vera Rubin Observatory, the James Webb Space Telescope. These are enormous billions of dollars of the Large Hadron Collider. These are just enormous Super Kamiokande. So it's essentially and another way to see this as someone who does study things like the Nobel Prize is that there hasn't been like a single winner, a lone winner of the
Mm,
Nobel Prize in many decades. I
yeah.
forget the exact last person to win it solo, but it was
Mm,
very common, 100 years ago, or, when it's been around for 124 years now.
mm,
So it was very common, or, much more common. But now it's basically, kind of huge collaborations, and then people get all mad because LIGO or LHC had 5,000 people that discovered the Higgs boson, and yet, at most three people can win it because of their
mm,
refusal to change their rules and their obstinance,
mm,
the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences, which I've had the honor or whatever, the shame or of
mm,
nominating winners for the Nobel Prize. And that's why I kind of went off on this quest to
mm.
see, does it really represent how science is done
Yeah.
nowadays? Maybe it was done that way 124 years ago when William Röntgen invented the X-ray, and that did provide a single person in the previous year who conferred the greatest benefit on mankind. But,
Mm,
7 years after that, there was Gustav Dalén who invented the lighthouse regulator for buoys, and so, does
mm,
that really affect you over
mm.
there? I know in San Diego I use lighthouses instead of the GPS to get around, but
Yeah.
I'm unique. So yes, to answer his question, I do
Mm,
believe that epoch is mercifully coming to a close, if it
mm.
if it really does exist
Yeah.
anymore, because of these. Now, that's not to say that there aren't a tremendous number of people that aren't tortured. I
Mm.
get dozens of emails. I'm looking at emails I got, yesterday, the day before, people writing me, Professor Keating, I need your help. Here's this paper I've written. I've checked it out with ChatGPT. ChatGPT agrees with me. It's brilliant. It's going to change the world. It's going to resolve the black hole information paradox. It's a new
Yeah.
theory of everything. It breaks the second law of thermodynamics. And this is just one paper, right? And I get five of them, and they all say the same thing. Like, I've checked it out with ChatGPT. It
Yeah, yeah.
verifies. They have no awareness that that's what these things are
Mm.
designed to do.
Yeah.
Because if they don't, the user experience is horrible, right? If you use a thing and says like, "You're an idiot, Matt,"
Mm.
or Brian, you should not be like submitting this drivel. Like, I have a lot of ideas too, but not a lot of
Yeah.
them would pass muster outside of ChatGPT. So it's been a real
Mm.
boon to people working alone, and therefore it's encouraging a lot of them to perceive themselves as having this lone genius
Mm.
resurrection from the bygone era in which it harmed people's mental health. So
Yeah.
I do
Yeah.
worry about that sycophanty attribute of them and the
Mm.
hallucinations that come along with it. So
Mm.
it may come again, but in mainstream science, less so.
Yeah. It's not healthy locking
No,
yourself in a dark room for 5 years and coming out with a theory of everything. It's just that's just we're done with that. It's a
no,
social network now, isn't it? Inevitably.
that's right.
Um, there's another question here. So, oh yeah, this points to cosmology, the speculative philosophy. I mean, have you ever worried that your own work approaches that boundary? Possibly.
Of being a lone genius? No, I don't.
Well, no, no,
My
no,
wife will
not being
disabuse me.
not being.
My mother-in-law will make me
You're a
clear.
sociable genius.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
have
yeah.
you worried that your own work might be approaching speculative philosophy ever?
Uh, Speculative, no. I would say that what I try to do always, my philosophy of experimental cosmology is to do always never do one thing. Okay.
Mm,
Um, so, and that means in the following sense, if you build an experiment, it should at least be able to solve more than one problem. It should solve at
right.
least two problems. In other words,
Mm,
not only look for the origin of the universe. So the Simons Observatory has the ability, or let me just go back to BICEPS. So BICEP was a failure, right? It was. I mean, I know you said a lot of nice things about it, and I agree with you. But I'm just saying, a cynic could say, "Oh, it was a failure. It cost $10 million. You made this huge announcement. It was on the front page of the Guardian, the New York Times, the San Diego Union Tribune. It was on CNN, NBC,
mm,
ABC, NPR." And then you had to retract your claim, right? Okay,
mm,
so fine. But look what else it did. It also showed us that the galaxy is incredibly messy, dirty, filthy
mm.
place. And I was going to say like New Jersey or Los Angeles here, but I'm sure you've got what's your neighboring town that you hate? That's your football club. What's your rival football club
Gloucester.
there, Matt? What?
I can't believe you got me to say it, Gloucester.
Gloucester. Okay, good. All right, those buggers in Gloucester. Okay, let's look at them. Okay, so it's
Savages. They're savages.
it's a filthy place, right? So the galaxy is like Gloucester, okay? It's
Yeah.
full of dust and smog and soot and grime, and a bootlick should never even set foot in it, right, Matt? I mean, no person would be there in their right mind. But we learned about that so much so that there's huge careers and new studies about the galactic
Yeah.
chemistry,
Yeah.
cosmochemistry, the even tiny particles. Your countryman Fred Hoyle was a big believer that meteorites carried life to the Earth, and perhaps that
Mm.
it could cause the flourishing of life due to what's called panspermia carried on
Mm.
meteorites.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
now we've learned a lot about some of the parameter space. So this is all to say we set out to do one thing, but we
Mm.
did something much more practical. And of course, we would have preferred that we didn't do the practical thing and learn so much about dust, right? It's like a lot of things in life you'd prefer to be ignorant about, maybe.
Yeah.
But now that we know about it, now it's informed all these other experiments, like the Simons
Mm.
Observatory, and how to optimize it so we won't make that mistake. And that's what
Yeah.
science is. Science is a,
Yeah.
a process of always being wrong, but
Mm.
quantifying how
Yeah.
wrong you are. So I don't worry about that. So even in my experiments, that are going after similar topics, no, I always make sure that we're able to do many other things, including some things that on their own would also win a Nobel Prize. Like, for example, one of the things that we can do with the Simons Observatory that for technical reasons we couldn't do with BICEPS is look for the impact of neutrinos, these
Mm.
near massless
Yeah.
particles. They have a tiny bit of mass. They're the only form of dark matter that we know exists for sure.
Mm.
We may detect what they're actually made of and how they behave and what their masses are. That would be a huge achievement
Mm.
that no one's ever done in history.
Mm.
We may detect planet nine, the ninth planet in our solar system, another huge thing that
Mm.
could be done with this. So there's like 45 or 50 different things that I can do with this experiment that guarantee, and only one of them or two, I'll say two of them because I have another one that's very speculative,
Mm.
called searching for Lorentz invariance violation. But if either one of even if either one of those two don't pan out, so to speak, which were the main reasons that we built the instrument, we are building the instrument, but we have 48 other consolation prizes that are
Mm.
each, in some sense, worthy of the
Mm.
greatest prize you can imagine.
Mm. Brian, something's just occurred to me because you've spoken to so many guests. I mean, what was it you said? Sort of 30 odd Nobel Prize winning guests. You've had such a
22, yeah, 22 Nobel Prize.
sorry, man. But you've had such a
Yeah.
plethora of different opinions on philosophy, the nature of reality, mysticism, even in cases, So has this informed your own sort of metaphysical outlook? And, or can it make you? I mean, sometimes for me, being exposed to all of these deep and sort of complicated ideas, it kind of drives me a little bit crazy. And sometimes I can't sleep for days, after researching some of this stuff. So I don't know, just how has it impacted you as a person, and does it change the way you think about reality?
Well, I do feel, I have an unusual for professional cosmologist. I think I have an unusual curiosity, and I have an outlet for that in that I have this podcast that I can talk to people about very speculative things from philosophy to AI to, extrasolar life to cosmology, theories of everything, the philosophy of cosmology. I would say for me, it's less sort of, philosophical crises or conundra that I suffer from, but it, it's more that I get pulled in so many different directions. I'm so interested, I'm so
Mm,
acutely aware of the finitude of life.
mm,
And I'm so torn by wonderful distractions in my life, called my kids and my wife and my family that, I don't really suffer from that.
mm,
It's said that a man like, who has to hunt his own game for food every day in some tribe somewhere, he's not really having a metaphysical crisis, right? He's not having, for me, it's more the, kind of the battles that I have, and I've come to be, if I suffer from any kind of crisis of confidence, it's been the recognition that science can sort of, have a little bit of too big of a notion of its own importance. And I think
mm,
the way that this manifests itself is that most scientists, myself included, or let me say most professors, myself included, are, kind of important but not significant. And I'll say in the following way, like we're important because we train the next generation, we contribute novel things, but we're not like, we know we're not significant. Like we're not changing social policy. Like my colleagues are all mad at Trump, for example, cutting all these funds and so forth. They can't do anything about it. Like there's no way they can do it. So they take out, their rage and online and so forth. And, it could be sympathetic to it, but the point is they know that they can't really affect any change as a scientist, nor really, I mean, I wouldn't want to be led by scientists instead of politicians. I wish the politicians had a better grasp of science. But
Yeah,
the
yeah.
degree to which the scientists and professors, more professors, I mean, some of the dumbest ideas come out of academia. And almost any, kind of thing that's preposterous to believe, could never be, foisted upon my friend who's a gardener or something like that. But my academicians will start to think about these things in great detail. So, and I think that's because we have this luxury of being paid to think and having tenure and permanent employment, and so we've lost sight of the fact that we have customers. The customers are the public, and they pay our
Mm,
salaries no matter
mm,
what you are. If you're at Harvard, a private institution, I don't care. You're still supported by
mm,
public funds. And to the degree you alienate your customer by saying they're not intelligent enough to grasp the
mm,
brilliance of your arguments, then you risk your livelihood. And I think you should. I think it's quite right that the public should demand accountability from scientists as well. And we
mm,
saw a tremendous failure of that, obviously, during COVID and many other instances where people have been kind of led down the primrose path. So I do feel
mm.
like I don't have any major kind of metaphysical crises in regarding cosmology, but I sometimes do when I think about the profession of being a cosmologist. So those are the distinctions I like to make.
Right. Um, what's your position on religion then and God, if I may ask, Brian? Because,
Yeah, it's
it's sort of
mhm.
somehow the last sort of 20, 30 years, it felt traditional that science was about materialist atheism, and it would seem contradictory somehow to sort of go to church and believe in the black, the Big Bang and all that. But these days, not so. I mean, I was chatting to Philip Goff recently. He says he's what is he? He's a heretical Christian, and he's made a home in the Anglican Church, who are very metaphysically cool and progressive, So. And I'm kind of quite mystical these days, having come from quite a sciencey, maths and computational background, and it seems like everyone seems to be on a journey these days with this.
Right.
Quite a lot of metaphysical traffic. So
Well,
where are you with this stuff? How does God
yeah,
and
I mean, I
physics
like to
work?
say that, science, the word science, comes from Latin scientia, which means knowledge. And my phone has a lot of knowledge, and ChatGPT has a lot of knowledge. It has no wisdom, right? What we really would like is artificial wisdom. Like you ask a question, you don't want to get like 10 different links or 10 different opinions, or say you're so brilliant, Matt, for wondering where you can get the best blood pudding for Christmas breakfast, bangers and mash. I would say like the quest. I gave a talk at the Royal Institution, which was incredibly fun. And I put up, the big controversy is if you have a big bang, who's the big banger? And I put up a picture of a bangers and mash, as you call it, and the crowd went wild.
Just briefly, there's a great lyric from a Frank Zappa song. It says, "Lord have mercy on the people in England and the terrible food these people must eat."
And such small portions, Matt.
Yeah,
This is
yeah, 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 yeah.
I'm there. It's
How
terribly
do we even
small. I'm like,
survive?
I'm an American. I need a big banger in the
Yeah,
morning, right?
yeah.
Um, so you're right. This has always been. I mean, Fred Hoyle coined the term Big Bang,
Mm,
and he did it as a pejorative because it smacked to him of religion and a
mm,
creation and so forth. So I think it's natural, and certainly you can't falsify the existence of a God. But you ask me like personal, like I always say, I don't believe in God the same way I don't believe in gravity. Like I have
mm,
evidence for gravity. But God is sort of much more inscrutable. I mean, as I said earlier, I'm Jewish. I call myself a deeply, very orthodox, practicing agnostic. And I think agnostic in the sense that I'm searching, not in the sense that I can't know. Like my
mm,
first guest on the podcast was, again, your late great countryman, Freeman Dyson. And
mm,
Freeman and I used to talk about religion. And I said to him one day on a podcast, I said, Freeman, you call yourself an agnostic. But imagine, hyper intelligent alien species watching you on a Sunday morning. They look at you and they look at your neighbor, Richard Dawkins. You both don't go to the same church, right? You both stay home, right? You both don't do the same thing. So how do you distinguish yourself
Mm.
from an atheist? Are you just copping out and saying you're an agnostic so you don't, he won the Templeton Prize, which is given for, religious, kind of philosophy and writings and so. So he didn't really have a good answer. I mean, I love Freeman. I miss him a lot. He used to visit here and see me and come to my house in the winters from Princeton.
Oh.
But he didn't really give a great answer. And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that if you were to believe, then you have obligations, which you don't have if you don't believe, right? So
Mm.
if you do believe in one of the standard monotheistic religions, at least the only ones I'm familiar with, then you have certain obligations. So I practice Judaism. In other words, I keep the Shabbat, the Sabbath. I don't work on it. I don't send emails. I don't do
Mm.
podcasts. I don't. I do things. I go to a temple. I keep kosher, to the letter of the law of kosher, not, perfect kosher. I'm sure I fall
Mm.
short of what a rabbi might do.
But these are kind of
And
healthy things. These are really healthy things. I reckon a day without technology would be a great thing for me, to be
oh,
honest.
it's a wonderful thing. Yeah, I mean, and people are talking about it all the time, even non-Jews, as a sabbatical. I
Mm.
mean, we have the word sabbatical in academia for the very thing that you get
Mm.
refreshed, recharged by changing, slowing down, and manipulating your, reactive monkey mind, so you don't
Mm.
have to always be, in pursuit of the next shiny object in
Mm.
academia, which is plentiful.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a great deal of wisdom in religion. It may not be,
Mm.
knowledge. It may have zero scientific knowledge. I mean,
Mm.
the Bible, the Torah, which I study, and I read Hebrew fluently, and I study the Talmud and all these other documents in religion. It's very clear the sun and the moon are created on the fourth day. And so you're like, well, what does that mean? Like, how could it be possible that they didn't know what a day was back
Mm.
in, that the day was caused by the orbit of the sun around the earth, right? They're so stupid, they're so primitive.
Mm.
But if you take off the Sam Harris, and I've debated Sam Harris about this on my podcast, which is not very pleasant for either one of us, I think.
I've not actually seen that one. I should go and check that
Oh
out.
yeah, yeah. It's 3.5 hours. It was supposed to be 1 hour. We were having such a good time. I said, Sam, I know your producer said you only have 1 hour. Can you go longer? We went for 3.5 hours, and then at the very end, I asked him, about he made a statement about slavery and how illogical the Bible is, and how he and I in 5 minutes could come up with a better document than the Bible. And I started to kind of gently nudge him in a respectful way, but I don't
Mm.
think he liked it, and he so far has not shown willingness to come back on my podcast, but that's okay. I'll need to talk to him once.
Hmm.
But the point is, even if you don't have such a jaded, cynical hostility towards a
Mm.
religious document, and look, I'm Jewish, I can read the Quran. I mean,
Mm.
I don't have a hostility towards it. I can
Mm.
read it as a religious document. I was an altar boy in the Catholic Church in New York. That's another thing I've done. I can
Mm.
read these documents that I don't practice, and I can react in a respectful way. I talked to John C. Lennox last week. He was a lovely guy, a very devout Christian, as you know, maybe Christian apologist and mathematician of the highest order at
Mm.
Oxford. He and I talked about, some of my challenges that I have for him when it came to things like the ascension of Jesus and the resurrection from a physicist standpoint. Anyway,
Mm.
but the
Yeah.
point is, if you can talk respectfully, then you can know that, for example, you'd be willing to the open to the idea that at least when the Torah, the Bible, the Old Testament says the sun is created on the fourth day, it's doing that for a reason that has nothing to do with science.
Of
And you're
course.
an
Yeah.
idiot if you read it
Mm.
as a scientific interpretation,
Yeah.
because you're only trying to substantiate, and straw man it. But
Mm.
but the way, and I'll just say, for a lot of Judaism is centered on the Exodus from Egypt, where Jews were documented to have been slaves in Egypt. Now, the number and the exact nature of the Exodus, we can debate that scientifically. I don't really care about that. But
Mm.
the point was, when the Torah was written by, you could say, men, multiple people, you could say by Moses, whatever you want. The dominant culture of the time, the superpowers, there were two superpowers. It was Babylonia and it was Egypt. And those two powers were at war. And what did they both worship as their key, sustaining, godhead? It was the sun. It was, in
Mm.
both cases, it was the sun, and the second god was the moon. And even in Arabic words, the notions of these things are present still hundreds of years after
Mm.
Jesus lived. So the Torah is coming to tell us that these things that we say that nature was created. So
Mm.
therefore, don't worship nature. And the Torah is plenty hard on Jews and people that purport to believe this and be sanctimonious and so forth. But what I'm bringing up is that the Torah has some wisdom in it. And
Mm,
if you just suspend the fact that you're always looking for knowledge, knowledge is abundant,
mm,
but wisdom, to kind of paraphrase Einstein, encircles the world. If you can have wisdom, I'd much rather have AW than AI. I mean, there's
mm,
plenty of AI, but there's very few people I consider wise. So that
mm,
for me is the reason for at least my own personal, resuscitation or resurrection, to mix
mm,
metaphors, to mix religions, of this interest that I personally have. I find it fascinating.
mm,
It's such a rich thing to study. And people that dismiss it as, Bronze Age, like our friend Lawrence Krauss, now,
mm.
semi-disgraced here in America because of his involvement, we've learned, with Jeffrey Epstein
Oh,
and other things.
oh, crikey. Right.
But he used to say, it's Bronze Age peasants, but you would never say, like,
Mm,
Archimedes was basically just, post Bronze Age, but he
mm.
and Aristotle sure did get a lot of things
Yeah.
wrong about science.
I
We
was going to
still
say the
read him every day.
pre-Socratics were quite a bright bunch as well, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Plato, right?
yeah, 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 yeah,
We wouldn't want to emulate them. So anyway, Matt,
yeah.
that's sort of where I'm at. I do find that there's potential for meaning. If you grow up without it, though, if you grow up with a parent, as I did, who is a devout atheist, who hated religion, never set foot in a temple or
Mm,
a church, then I think it's very hard to at least be open to the idea that religion can provide you meaning, let alone
mm,
believe in God, whatever that
mm.
means.
Yeah,
I don't, like I said, I don't believe in God. I don't think God is like upstairs in a white beard. And that's where I
mm,
have things in common with Richard
mm.
Dawkins, and he and I can talk about that.
Yeah, yeah.
But at least it has to be done with an intellectual honesty, and I find that's lacking from people like Sam Harris and others.
Mm, yeah, in some sense, they're more absolutist than sort of the mystics. I mean, for me,
In many ways.
atheism is one of the most fundamentalist positions you can
Oh
get
yeah,
because
yeah.
it's
There's
kind of like,
almost
well,
no
hang on,
one
you've
as
just you've just told us
yeah,
that we can't prove one way or the other whether there's a God, and now you're telling us there certainly isn't one. I mean,
right,
I think one of the chapters in Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, was actually entitled "Why There Almost Certainly Is No God." Right,
right.
and that was before the chapter where he looked for this thing in the brain called the God spot, was responsible for all of our mystical experiences and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it was fashionable back then. I remember I've been on this kind of journey. I was raised Catholic myself.
Mhm.
My parents and aunts and uncles didn't have a great experience with Catholic school, and they were like whipped and beaten by nuns and things like this.
Oh,
So it's pretty harsh. Very
yeah.
Victorian kind of mentality in some of those places. So I drifted away from it, and it was like me and my mates were just down with Richard Dawkins, Stephen Hawking, it was all the scientists, that kind of stuff. These guys will have all the answers, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
remember there was a time in sort of mid 90s where we thought, we're going to get the unified field theory.
Yeah.
We're going to unite, sort of Einsteinian mathematics with quantum field theory and all this kind of stuff, and we're going to get them, but we haven't, have we? We
No, and
haven't,
that's
Brian. So when
that's
when will
the
when will we get everything? I mean, I spoke to Jenny Nielsen, who's also another. She's a practicing Catholic. So she talked about mysticism, religion, and also the physics. But have you come across her work? She's working on a topological
no, I
unified.
know.
She
Yeah,
lost she
I
lost me
haven't.
at she lost me at fiber bundles, but she's a very interesting character.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, if she has any books and interest in coming on my show, I'd like to talk to her. I
Mm,
haven't encountered her work, but to answer your question, yeah, there's been this, kind of consistent search for it, and even in
mm,
Stephen Hawking's, most famous of all books, A Brief History of Time,
mm,
he says at the end, when string theory, turns out to be the theory of everything, for quantum gravity and the reconciliation of the quantum with the macroscopic
but
gravitational.
notice he said when, not if.
Yes,
But
yeah, it's
yeah.
basically when
Mm,
then we will know the mind of God. And obviously he was an
mm.
atheist, and his wife at the time, he's a very sordid person, by the way.
Yeah.
Not to like denigrate his memory, but there's a book written by Charles Seif, who's a professor in New York University, called Hawking, like selling Hawking. And I do remember going to a speech that he gave at the Royal Academy, and he could still respond to questions. 1995, it would take 10 minutes, but he would
Mm,
type out with his eyes,
yeah.
amazingly.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was certainly, inspirational in that sense. But
Yeah.
someone in the audience said, like, Stephen, why did you write A Brief History of Time? Like, it's rumored that almost nobody has ever gotten all the way through it. And he said very slowly, I remember him saying, because I needed to pay for my daughter's private school. It's very funny. And but yeah, at the
Yeah.
end, I think he had this battle with his wife, and he says in the book that every equation cuts the readership by half, but every
Hmm.
mention of God doubles it. So he was trying
Hmm.
to kind of play these forces off of each other. I
Yeah.
don't think he was cynical about it, but I think he, I think he truly, and I don't fault him. I mean, if God forbid, I mean, I shouldn't say whatever, Zeus forbid, uh, that anybody is in that state, but they might justifiably have violent, kind of beliefs. If God exists,
Mm.
why did he do this to me, right? But I
Yeah.
think if you look at God as a celestial butler, if you look at him as just this wish making, slot machine that just, of course, you're going to have a childlike view of it. I mean, Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space,
Mm.
when he was interviewed, he said, as soon as he landed, like they asked him, "What'd you see up there?" He said, "Well, I know what I didn't see. I didn't see a man in a white beard." Well, I don't believe that there's a guy in a white beard floating at 200,
Yeah.
kilometers above the Earth's
Yeah.
surface. I don't believe that either. I think it's
Yeah.
stupid. I
Mm.
think it's childish. But the question is, what is the fruit? As Jesus said, judge the tree by its fruit. And so, what do these religions produce? So, I'm not going to
Mm.
speculate, but look at what Judaism has contributed. Look at Christianity. Look at Islam. Look at the different contributions, and then look at atheists. Don't
Mm.
not look at atheism, but you have to look at, like, are these people generally happy? Are they generally
Mm.
promoters? Because the fourth commandment, sorry, the third commandment is, don't carry the name of the Lord in
In
vain.
vain. Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah.
It's not
Mm.
really clear what King James meant by all these things,
Mm.
but in Judaism it means, like, don't profess to be religious
Mm.
and do things wickedly by the excuse of the fact that you're doing things godly, but also don't, like, ascribe, like, your personality problems and your traits to my religion. Basically,
Mm.
if you want to be a good ambassador for the religion, and you're in, a horrible mood and you're an unhappy person, you might want to think of another religion, right?
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
uh, all
Yeah.
that's just to
Go
say, it's
go and be grumpy with them. Yeah.
exactly. So I do feel like there are very important questions to answer and to think about, but you
Yeah.
have to be comfortable knowing that you won't get cognitive closure on all these things because they're not
Mm.
epistemically amenable, right? There's
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
there's no microscope that will find God.
Mm.
I've had debates with people, even like John Lennox and Stephen Meyer and all, Christian apologists,
Mm.
and they can be guilty
Mm.
of cherry picking certain things too. So
Mm.
I do believe that there's you have to be humble, epistemic humility, and that we
Mm.
won't have necessarily ever have all the answers, Matt. But the
Mm.
point that we have to always remind ourselves of is that we must not, shy away from the pursuit
Mm.
of attempting to answer them. We may never answer
Mm.
them, but don't step away because it's too hard.
Mm. I love that. That's beautiful. But could I just, I mean, do you think that the sort of deterministic, mechanistic stance of scientism, if you like, is that softening? And there's new players in town now in neuroscience. You've got people like sort of Donald Hoffman talking about consciousness being fundamental. You've got emergence of different metaphysical systems. Philip Goff talking about panpsych. Apparently, 33% on Phil papers now. 33% of the philosophers published there are now non-materialist, and that figure
Yeah.
seems to be going up. So, are we going through a kind of Thomas Kuhn style, paradigm shift in science writ large, or in physics? I mean, what do you think?
It could be. I mean, I don't have my, kind of finger on the pulse of that, kind of ideological or philosophical, kind of a universe, to be honest with you. But in my own, sense, I do believe that there is no meaning in science. Like, science is a beautiful thing. Just like I don't think that there's a meaning that you can ascribe to life from pure mathematics, where you can actually at least prove some things. You can't prove everything, as Gödel showed, but you can
Mm,
prove some things. You can't prove everything. But in science, we can't prove anything. I mean, there's no saying that
mm,
gravity won't be negative tomorrow due to some, modification of dark energy, right? So
mm,
there's no provable fact, right? Because we can't falsify all the alternatives.
mm,
So in my sense, that means that you shouldn't look for meaning in science, which is fine. I get meaning from my job of being a scientist, but I don't find meaning in like, well, here's this, star with a certain, magnitude and color diagram. Okay, it's
mm,
it's
mm,
it's an interesting fact. But I also think it's dangerous to kind of go, too far on the other side and say that, everything, as John Lennox might say, like, everything is guided by not only religion and God, but like Jesus Christ himself. I mean, that, as I told him, like I don't, we Jews don't subscribe to the fact that Jesus was, the Son of God and that
Mm,
he was the Messiah and all these other things that John believes in. On the other hand, there are lesser claims that we do establish and we do believe in. So I think but does that mean I can't get mean? I already quoted from
mm.
Jesus a few times today, right? So, one of my favorites is don't criticize your neighbor for the mote of dust in his eye when you have a log in your own eye, right? So
I love
that's
that.
not Jewish. That's Jesus, right? So, and the dust, as I said before, go to
Yeah.
briankeating.com/review and you can get your own piece of dust, Matt. So
Mm,
I'm kind of a pragmatist. I come from the school of, shut up and measure, and the philosophical interpretations. I just got done teaching quantum mechanics to
mm,
advanced undergraduates. We don't spend much time on interpretations of quantum mechanics.
mm.
But in another sense, it was very delightful to, encounter these things and be able to measure things to 13 decimal places. That to me
Mm.
is a beautiful thing, but it's not meaningful.
Mm. Gosh, that's actually quite. I wasn't expecting that, Brian, because from a physicist, because
Yeah.
I'm thinking, if you've got two different sort of sub disciplines of mathematics or physics that arrive at the same number and things like that, there's something so beautiful and profound about that, isn't there? Didn't
Yeah.
wasn't the speed of light arrived at slightly differently through studying electromagnetism and things like that? Was it Faraday? I'm not sure.
Well, yeah, I
But,
went to well, certainly I spoke at the Royal Institution where Faraday was, and
mm.
that was incredible. And I had his actual original equipment, and he was the one who came up with the lines of force and force fields and that whole concept. And
You had
then
his
this summer,
original equipment there. You had his
yeah,
that's
I
oh
actually
my
used
God.
his original like iron filings
Oh
suspended
my
in
God.
wax. It was incredible. Yeah, no, you can
I,
find it on their YouTube channel.
that's
It's
cool.
100,000 views or something by now. But no, I went to Maxwell's. I haven't published this video yet, but I went to Maxwell's birthplace on India Street in Edinburgh, and I went to the Royal Observatory of Edinburgh and did some videos and interviews there. And
Mm,
no, it was incredible what he. But look, this is a perfect example of
mm,
how science and wisdom like don't really go hand in hand. So imagine Maxwell had this idea for electromagnetic radiation. He proved it thanks to Oliver Heaviside and others that it actually was these four equations then could be unifying electricity and magnetism. And as a side benefit, on the side, they also predict waves of radiation that
mm,
travel at this universal speed.
mm,
But Maxwell couldn't understand how that was possible without there being some medium, which we would later call the ether, and then that would
mm,
later be disproven. But he had
mm.
this mechanistic idea where there were these vortices and gears and whirlpools. And so imagine you're back in 1862 and you see this paper on Twitter, and it's like, oh, well, there are waves of light that travel at a universal speed, and they're carried upon gears and vortices and whirlpools and
Mm.
yeah, this guy's an idiot. Like ChatGPT would say he's wrong, even Matt. So there's a
Mm.
danger, in kind of being too right and
Yeah,
being
yeah.
too married to this explanation, even
Mm,
from a philosophical point of view. But anyway,
mm.
this has been great, and had a great time talking with you, my natural philosophers in the audience. Very much enjoy it, and I'm being called to go to another meeting, so
Brian,
I gotta run.
it's been a massive honor and a privilege. Thank you so much for talking to me, and hopefully we can speak again sometime.
That'd be great. Maybe I'll bring a meteorite to see you next time I'm visiting some stone piles in a mound outside of
I
just to
would
go
love
to
that.
Gloucester. I'm just not going to set foot in Gloucester. I'm
If
not going
you
to
can
go
wear a
there.
Druid robe, we'll definitely avoid Gloucester. Take care, Brian,
All right, and Merry Christmas to you too.
and to you as well. Merry Christmas.
Thank
Take
you
care
so
now.
much, my friend.
Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.
Bye bye.